The sterile glow of the overhead lights reflected off the smooth metal walls of Xenogen labs. Inside, countless scientists and researchers worked tirelessly, their whispered conversations blending into the hum of high-tech machinery. But deep in the heart of the research compound, in a heavily secured containment chamber, something far more secretive was unfolding. She was standing inside the glass-walled room, El'Varia. Her presence was hypnotic. Unlike anything humanity had encountered before, she was a vision of ethereal beauty, tall and slender, her luminescent skin shifting between shades of deep sapphire and violet, reflecting the pulses of energy that flowed through her. Her long, flowing silver-white hair shimmered under the artificial lights, framing an angular, regal face with glowing golden eyes. She was Nyxari, one of the last of her kind, and she had been here for far too long. On the other side of the glass stood Commander Darius Vale, his dark eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. He had been tasked with overseeing the experiment, ensuring that humanity could discover the ultimate secret, the possibility of interspecies reproduction between humans and Nyxari. But tonight, the experiment was failing. "I told you," El'Varia's voice echoed in his mind, even though her lips remained motionless. "I will not do this again." Her gaze burned into him, a mixture of defiance and something else, something deeper. Darius exhaled slowly, running a hand through his jet-black hair streaked with silver. "El'Varia," he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "We don't have a choice. The Council is demanding results." She narrowed her eyes, her bioluminescent markings flashing red in agitation. "You do not understand. The bond between my kind and yours, it is not like humans think. It is not simple breeding. It is something else." Darius had heard this before, but even with all the data collected from the first two encounters, even with everything he had witnessed, he didn't fully understand what she meant. The connection between them had become stronger, almost unbearable. He felt it even now, a magnetic force between them, something beyond science. He wanted her, not because of the experiment, not because of orders, because she was unlike anything he had ever known. But El'Varia was resisting. "This will not happen again," she repeated, stepping forward. "I will not allow your people to reduce what we are into something lesser." Darius clenched his jaw. He had spent years serving the Council, following orders, never questioning the mission. But this was different. This was her. "You don't trust me," he said quietly. El'Varia hesitated. Before she could answer, the alarms blared. The chamber's lights flickered. A deep rumble shook the facility. Darius turned sharply toward the control panel, just as a warning message flashed across the screen. "Security breach detected." "What the hell?" El'Varia's glowing eyes widened. "It's begun!" Darius spun back toward her. "What do you mean? What's begun?" She lifted her hand, and the bioluminescent lines on her skin began to pulse faster, brighter. The air inside the containment chamber shimmered, as if reality itself was distorting. Darius's heart pounded. Something big was coming, and for the first time he realized. She hadn't been resisting the experiment. She had been trying to warn him. The facility shook violently. Overhead lights flickered, plunging the room into bursts of darkness and cold, artificial light. Alarms blared from every direction, a deafening chorus of sirens and emergency broadcasts. Darius's pulse pounded. Security breach. Who could have infiltrated a place as locked down as Xenogen labs? He turned to El'Varia, her bioluminescent markings glowing wildly, shifting from deep blue to pulsing crimson. The Nyxari's gaze was fixed on the walls, as if she could see something he couldn't. "El'Varia!" Darius called over the alarms. "What's happening?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, her fingertips grazing the force field barrier between them. A ripple of energy spread through, The containment chamber. The next second, the security grid shattered. The glowing panels dimmed, the magnetic locks disengaged. The cell was open. Darius stepped back instinctively, his training kicking in. No one had been able to bypass the lab's security systems before. No one except, "You disabled the containment field?" he asked. El'Varia's golden eyes flickered toward him. "I told you. It has begun." The ground trembled again, and this time, Darius heard the distant echo of something metallic, tearing apart. He swore under his breath. If the intruder, whoever they were, could rip through the lab's reinforced defenses, then they were dealing with something far worse than rogue mercenaries. A voice crackled through the facility's speakers. "All personnel, evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. Hostile forces detected." The announcement was cut off by a sharp burst of static. El'Varia turned toward him fully now, her flowing silver-white hair moving as if caught in a gentle current. "I cannot stay here, Darius. I can't just let you go." He knew he should be calling for security, activating the emergency lockdown. But something inside him, something deep, primal, refused to let her go alone. She tilted her head, observing him as if searching for an answer he wasn't giving. "Then come with me." Darius opened his mouth, but before he could respond, a section of the wall exploded inward. A shockwave sent him flying, crashing against a nearby control panel. Sparks rained down from shattered cables as smoke billowed into the chamber. Coughing, he blinked through the haze and froze. Through the jagged hole in the wall, 3 figures emerged. Not human, not Nyxari. Their bodies were sleek, biomechanical, a fusion of living tissue and metallic plating. Their eyes glowed with an eerie white light, and their clawed fingers hummed with energy weapons. El'Varia tensed beside him. "The Vatharix," she whispered. "They found me." Darius pushed himself up, instincts screaming fight or die. He reached for his sidearm, but the moment his fingers brushed the handle, one of the creatures raised an arm. A bolt of crackling. White energy shot forward. Darius barely dodged. The attack struck the panel behind him, reducing it to molten slag. "El'Varia, run!" he shouted. But she didn't run. She stepped forward. Raising her hands, her body became a beacon of shimmering light. The air around her vibrated, charged, with invisible energy. The Vatharix hesitated. Just for a moment. Then El'Varia unleashed hell. A shockwave erupted from her, knocking the biomechanical creatures back. The lab's walls cracked under the force, and alarms sputtered and died as power surges rippled through the facility. Darius barely had time to process what had happened before El'Varia turned to him. "I cannot fight them alone," she said. Breathless, but determined. Darius looked at the fallen Vatharix, then at her. His entire life, he had followed orders. But in this moment, standing beside the most extraordinary being he had ever known, he realized he was done following. Then, "Let's get the hell out of here," he said. El'Varia extended her hand. Darius took it, and together, they ran. Darius and El'Varia sprinted through the collapsing corridors of Xenogen labs, alarms blaring around them. The Vatharix were right behind them, their heavy footfalls reverberating through the floor like a death march. The facility's emergency. Lights flickered, casting eerie red glows over the metal walls. Darius tightened his grip on El'Varia's hand. Despite the chaos, her touch felt warm, thrumming with energy, an energy that seeped into his skin, making his heartbeat synchronize with hers in an unsettling but exhilarating way. "We need to reach the launch bay," he said, leading her through a side passage. "There's a shuttle." "They won't let us leave," El'Varia interrupted, her voice steady despite the urgency. "They didn't come to capture me, Darius. They came to erase me." Darius swallowed hard. He had suspected as much. The Vatharix weren't bounty hunters or mercenaries. They were executioners. A sudden explosion rocked the facility, sending a fireball rolling down the hall behind them. Darius instinctively shielded El'Varia as debris rained down, shards of metal slicing through the air like shrapnel. She turned to him, her glowing golden eyes locking onto his. You don't understand, she said. If they destroy me, they destroy everything. Darius frowned. What do you mean? El'Varia hesitated for only a moment before she pressed her palm against his chest. A strange, thrumming sensation spread through his body, like electricity coursing through his veins. Then he saw it. Visions flooded his mind, not memories, knowledge. He saw her people, the Nyxari, a once great civilization, scattered across the stars. He saw the Vathorics, their relentless pursuers, hunting them down one by one. And then he saw something more terrifying than all of it. A spark, a fusion of energy unlike anything in the universe. The bond between Nyxari and humans wasn't just biological. It was something greater, a merging of essence, of life forces. If a Nyxari and a human truly connected, truly bonded, they could create something beyond both species, a power neither race had ever known, and the Vathorics wanted to wipe it out before it could happen. Darius gasped as the vision faded, his mind spinning. You're saying, if we... El'Varia looked away. That's why the experiments failed. They didn't understand what they were trying to force. Darius ran a hand through his hair, his pulse still erratic. This wasn't just about genetics. This was something deeper. The Council hadn't known, the scientists hadn't known. But the Vathorics knew, and now so did he. A deep, guttural snarl echoed from the corridor behind them. The Vathorics were coming. El'Varia grabbed his arm. We need to go, now! Darius shook off his shock and nodded. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but one thing was clear. He wasn't letting them take her. They burst into the launch bay, a vast metallic chamber filled with idle shuttles. The control room sat above them, and the massive blast doors that led to the outside world were already sealing shut. Darius swore. We won't make it in time. El'Varia's markings pulsed. Yes, we will. Before he could ask what she meant, she turned to him, placing both hands on his chest. Trust me, she whispered. A sudden surge of energy shot through Darius like a lightning strike. He gasped as his muscles tensed, his entire body vibrating with unseen power. He felt stronger, faster, his senses sharpening as if his very DNA was being rewritten. He turned to El'Varia in shock, but she simply nodded. Run! Darius moved, and, for the first time in his life, he felt unstoppable. Together, they sprinted toward the nearest shuttle. The Vathorics stormed into the bay, their weapons primed. Darius dove into the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the controls. The engines roared to life just as the first energy blast struck the ship's hull. El'Varia turned, raising her hands. The air rippled. A barrier of pure energy erupted around the shuttle, absorbing the attacks. Darius pulled the thrusters. The ship lurched forward, bursting through the narrowing blast doors. And then, they were free. The shuttle rocketed into space, the burning wreckage of Xenogen labs shrinking behind them. The Vathoric's warship loomed in the distance, but it made no move to follow. Darius exhaled, his knuckles white against the controls. He turned to El'Varia. What now? She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Now, she murmured. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. Now we decide what we are. The vast expanse of space stretched endlessly before them, a sea of darkness punctuated by distant stars. The stolen shuttle drifted silently, its navigation systems stabilizing after their daring escape. Darius leaned back in the pilot's chair, breathing heavily. His muscles still tingled from the surge of power El'Varia had given him. Whatever she had done, it had changed him. He could feel it in the way his heart beat differently, the way his senses had sharpened. Across from him, El'Varia sat in quiet contemplation. The soft glow of the ship's console reflected off her, luminescent skin casting ethereal patterns across her face. Her golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Darius finally broke the silence. They didn't follow us. El'Varia nodded. They don't need to. Darius frowned. What do you mean? She hesitated, then turned to him fully, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. Darius, the bond between a Nyxari and a human is not just physical. It is not just about creating life. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the back of his hand. The moment they touched, a familiar surge of energy coursed through him. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just power, it was connection. Emotions flooded his mind, not his own, but hers. He could feel her hesitation, her fear, but also her longing. The weight of centuries spent in isolation, the ache of a species slowly dying, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found something worth holding on to. Darius sucked in a breath. El'Varia. She pulled her hand away, and the connection severed. The absence of it left him breathless. The Vathorics know what happens when a Nyxari and a human truly bond, she continued softly. They do not need to chase us, because they believe it is already too late. Darius narrowed his eyes. Too late for what? El'Varia hesitated again, then whispered, For me. His stomach clenched. What are you talking about? She stood and took a step toward the viewing window, her arms wrapped around herself. My kind. We were never meant to survive alone. The energy within us, our essence, it was always meant to be shared. That is how we lived, how we thrived. But we have been hunted for so long. We have forgotten what it means to truly bond. Darius rose from his seat, stepping closer. You said the experiments failed because they didn't understand. What is it they were missing? El'Varia turned, her golden eyes locking onto his. Choice. Darius stared at her. Humans tried to force it, she explained. But a true bond does not come from necessity. It comes from willingness, from something deeper than instinct, something neither my kind nor yours have fully understood. Darius swallowed hard. And if we do, El'Varia interrupted, there is no turning back. Silence fell between them. Darius could feel his pulse hammering. Not from fear, but from something else. Something he had been denying since the moment he first saw her. He had been drawn to her from the beginning. Not because of orders, not because of the experiment, but because she was unlike anyone he had ever known, and now he knew. She felt the same. El'Varia. He stepped closer, reaching out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. When his fingers brushed against her arm, a shockwave of warmth pulsed between them. Her breath hitched. Darius, if you do this, his voice was steady. I want to. She closed her eyes. Then let go. He didn't know what she meant until she pressed her palm against his chest. Everything changed. A surge of golden energy erupted between them, wrapping them in light. Darius gasped as he felt himself pulled into her essence, his body dissolving into something more than human. His mind expanded, stretching beyond the limits of flesh, and for the first time, he understood. This wasn't just a bond, it was fusion, not just of bodies, not just of souls, but of something new, something that had never existed before. And in that moment, he realized, this was what the Vathorics feared. Not war, not breeding, but love. Because love could create something greater than both species, combined. El'Varia shuddered against him, gasping as the connection solidified. When she opened her eyes, they were no longer just golden. They were infused with streaks of deep human brown, and Darius knew he was no longer just human. They had become something else entirely, together. Darius staggered backward, his chest rising and falling rapidly as his body struggled to adjust. The transformation had been instantaneous, yet its effects rippled through him in waves. His senses were heightened, colors were richer, sounds were clearer, and he could feel El'Varia's presence as if she was inside him, not just beside him. His gaze snapped to her. She was changed. The soft, shimmering glow of her Nyxari skin now held subtle, earthly warmth, like sunlight reflecting off water. Her golden eyes had streaks of deep human brown, and something in her stance, her very aura, had shifted. She wasn't just Nyxari anymore. She was both. El'Varia touched her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. This feeling, Darius, her voice trembled, and in that moment, he felt what she felt, a pulse between them, an unbreakable thread tying their very existence together. The bond was real, and it was permanent. Darius swallowed hard. "Are you okay?" El'Varia looked at him, and for the first time since they met, her expression was completely open. No walls, no hesitation, just raw, unguarded emotion. "I feel." She hesitated, searching for words. Complete. Darius exhaled sharply. He understood, because he felt the same. But then, a violent shockwave rocked the shuttle. Darius spun around as alarms blared. The Vatharix warship that had loomed in the distance was now moving toward them. His grip tightened on the console. "Damn it! I thought they weren't following us!" El'Varia's eyes widened in horror. "They weren't before, but now." She placed a hand over her heart, as if realizing something. They felt it. Darius frowned. "Felt what?" El'Varia turned to him, her voice urgent. "The bond, the fusion, it wasn't supposed to happen. It's something new, something never recorded before. And if we can feel it..." Darius's jaw clenched. So can they. The Vatharix didn't need to chase them before, because they thought the fusion was impossible. Now that it had happened, they weren't just hunting them. They were coming to destroy them. Another blast struck the shuttle, sending them spinning. Sparks erupted from the control panels. The ship wasn't built for combat. It was a stolen escape vessel, barely holding itself together. "We won't survive a direct hit," Darius shouted. El'Varia closed her eyes, her markings glowing brighter than ever before. "There's only one way out of this." Darius shook his head. "El'Varia, whatever you're thinking, trust me," she whispered. The moment she reached for him, he felt it. The power, the connection, the fusion deepening. A sudden force erupted from the ship, a golden shockwave of pure energy, rippling outward. It slammed into the approaching Vatharix warship, causing its engines to flicker, its trajectory to shift. Darius felt his body burning with the energy coursing through him. It wasn't just hers anymore, it was theirs. The Vatharix ship faltered. For the first time in history, they had encountered something they didn't understand, something stronger than them. Darius gasped as the energy settled, his vision blurred. The fusion had taken its toll. His body wasn't used to it yet. He stumbled, but El'Varia caught him. Her touch steadied him, and when he met her gaze, he saw something new in her expression. Not fear, not desperation, but hope. "The war isn't over," she said softly, "but it's changed. Forever." Darius exhaled, squeezing her hand. "Then let's give them something to fear." Outside, the Vatharix ship hesitated, a first for their ruthless species. And in that moment, Darius realized they had already won, because they had become something new, and the Vatharix had no idea how to stop it. The Vatharix warship loomed ahead, its dark metallic hull pulsing with ominous red light. Even with the temporary disruption El'Varia had unleashed, they were still outmatched. The stolen shuttle's shields were failing, the engines sputtering, and escape options were dwindling. Darius gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around the controls. "We can't fight them like this. We need a real plan." El'Varia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Darius." The way she said his name made his pulse stutter. There was something in her tone. Something final. He turned to her, his chest tightening. No. Whatever you're thinking, don't. She smiled softly, her golden brown eyes shimmering. There is no other way. Darius shook his head. We barely understand this fusion. If you push it too far, then let me show you. Before he could stop her, she reached for him, her fingertips pressing against his temple, and suddenly he saw everything, a vision unlike anything he had ever experienced. Flashes of time, not past, not future, but something beyond linear existence. He saw a world where humans and Nyxari were not enemies, but equals. A place where fusion was no longer an anomaly, but the foundation of something greater. A new species, a new civilization, a future where their two kinds had become one. He saw their child, not fully human, not fully Nyxari, but something new. Something stronger. A being with the wisdom of the stars and the passion of mankind. A child that should have never been possible. And yet, here they were. Darius gasped, snapping back into the present. El'Varia, his voice trembled. That was real, wasn't it? She nodded, her expression unreadable. It is the future we could create. But only if we survive. She exhaled, turning toward the approaching warship. Her entire body pulsed with light now, the fusion reaching its peak. Then let's make sure we do. Darius didn't hesitate. He grabbed her hand, and the moment their skin touched, the universe shifted. A surge of energy exploded outward, engulfing them both. The ship's failing systems roared back to life, power surging through its circuits. The golden pulse expanded. Beyond them, rippling toward the Vatharic's warship like a wave of pure evolution. And then, the warship stopped. Not because of damage, not because of a system failure, but because something inside the Vatharics themselves had changed. Through the fusion, through the bond between El'Varia and Darius, something new had been unleashed. Something even the Vatharics hadn't expected. The crew aboard the warship faltered. Their weapons dimmed. The hostility in their presence wavered, as if some long-buried instinct had suddenly awakened. Darius could feel it. The Vatharics were not immune to this connection. They had feared fusion because they believed it was a threat, but the truth was far more terrifying. It was an invitation, the possibility of something greater. For a long, agonizing moment, the warship did nothing. Then, it turned away. Darius's breath caught. Did they just retreat? El'Varia nodded, her body still glowing but dimming slightly. They felt it too. Darius exhaled, collapsing into the pilot's chair, his mind spinning. This wasn't the end of the war, but it was something far more important, the beginning of the end. El'Varia sat beside him, her fingers intertwining with his. We changed something today, Darius. He looked at her, his heart still racing. Yeah, we did, she smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. And for the first time since this all began, Darius truly believed they had a future. Not as human, not as Nyxari, but as something entirely new. The end, or just the beginning. What do you think? Should this world continue? Let me know if you want a sequel.